The first thing a person notices during a blackout is not the absence of light. It is the absence of sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the faint whisper of electricity in the walls, the streetlights buzzing outside, all of it disappears in a single instant, leaving a silence so complete that it presses against the skin. For many, that silence is unsettling but temporary. A candle is lit, a phone screen glows, and life resumes in a muted form until the power returns. But for others, that silence becomes something far heavier, a silence that swallows breath and thought, a silence that feels occupied. There are stories whispered in small towns and buried in old reports of nights when that silence was not empty at all. Nights when the blackout revealed something waiting in the dark, something that only moved when no light dared to touch it. Long before technology wrapped the world in its constant hum, darkness was the natural order. For centuries, humans feared it not only because they could not see, but because they felt what might be looking back at them. Fire was their only weapon, a fragile glow against vast fields of shadow. Some say that fear never left us, that deep inside we carry the memory of being prey. When the lights go out now, even for a moment, something ancient rises in the mind. A whisper that tells us we are once again exposed. Most ignore that whisper. Some do not live long enough to. One account describes a man who lived alone at the edge of a town plagued by storms. The night the power grid failed, he stood at his kitchen window watching the street vanish into a black so complete it seemed unnatural. His phone had already died earlier that evening. He had no candle, no flashlight. He told a neighbor later that he felt the air in the house change as though it thickened, carrying a damp weight. He said he heard movement on the wooden floor behind him, though he had not stepped away from the window. The moment he turned, there was nothing. He laughed it off, lit a match, and then froze. In the reflection of the glass, just before the flame revealed his own face, he saw another shape move past him. There are hundreds of such moments, scattered like broken fragments of memory, tied together only by the common thread of darkness. A family in a farmhouse claimed that during a regional blackout, they woke to footsteps on the staircase. They thought it was an intruder. But when they lit their lanterns, the steps stopped midway and never retreated. A child, too young to lie with conviction, told her parents she saw faces in the corners whenever their lamps flickered. An old man whispered that during the longest outage of his life, he heard his dead wife calling his name from outside, though she had been gone for nearly 10 years. Each account ends the same way. Light returning, silence breaking, and those who endured left unsure of what had been real and what had been imagined. But the imagination is not always strong enough to explain what remains after the blackout ends. Doors found wide open though they were locked. Windows unlatched. Clocks stopped at the exact minute the lights vanished. Scratches on the floorboards that had not been there the day before. When questioned, the survivors of these nights rarely spoke in detail. Many only said they did not want to remember. It was easier to let the blackout be blamed on faulty wires or fallen trees than to admit something else had moved with purpose in the dark. The most disturbing fact is not that these stories exist. It is that they appear across decades, across continents, across communities that never knew one another. The language differs, but the rhythm is the same. A sudden collapse into darkness. The heavy silence. The growing sense of being observed. A sound, a movement, a shadow that does not belong. And then when light returns, nothing can be proven, nothing can be traced, yet something remains changed in those who live through it. They describe sleep that never comes easily again. They describe nights spent with every lamp on, doors bolted, curtains sealed. They describe a fear that does not fade even years after the event. Why is it that so many people sense the same presence when the lights vanish? Is it only the mind recoiling against emptiness, creating shapes and sounds to fill the void? Or is there truly something that waits for those rare moments when technology fails, when modern defenses go silent, when the world resembles the primitive night our ancestors once feared? The human mind is fragile, but the consistency of these accounts raises questions that rationality cannot silence. Imagine a city block falling dark without warning. Windows no longer glow. Cars stall in the streets. The air conditioning units, the neon signs, the televisions, all dead. For most, panic grows in the absence of communication, in the knowledge that they are cut off from the larger world. But what if the true danger is not outside? Not the looters, not the collapsing order of society, but something within the black itself? What if the silence is not silence at all, but breath, slow and patient, pressing against every wall, waiting for someone to break it with a scream? The blackout does not just steal light. It strips away the illusion of safety. In those hours, a person is left with nothing but the raw awareness of their own heartbeat and the suspicion that it is not the only one in the room. Many survivors insist that the true terror is not the sight of something in the dark, but the certainty that they were never alone, that someone or something stood inches away unseen and chose not to move until it was too late to prove. The stories do not stop. They continue to surface, hidden in local archives, whispered by families who never wanted their names attached to superstition. They warn that what comes in the blackout is not bound by walls or windows. It arrives when the lights falter, when the silence grows too deep, when the mind dares to listen. And so the question lingers heavy and unanswered. If the dark was never empty, what exactly steps closer every time the lights go out? There is a town no one truly remembers unless they pass through by mistake. It does not appear on many maps anymore, the way certain places fade when progress forgets them. Once it had been alive with factory workers and their families, a small community with its own school, its own church, its own traditions. But the industries that birthed it left, and the town remained like a body with no pulse. Its houses standing in rows of weathered wood and chipped paint, its streets littered with weeds pushing through cracks in the asphalt. On quiet days when the sky pressed heavy with gray clouds, the town seemed less like a place where people lived and more like a photograph that had been left in the sun too long. It was here, in this forgotten town, that blackouts were more than an inconvenience. The aging power lines sagged between rusting poles, groaning in the wind. Storms often rolled through, sudden and merciless, plunging the entire grid into darkness. Generators were rare, flashlights scarcer. Candles became a kind of lifeline, their flames casting frail halos that fought the shadows. Residents grew accustomed to the routine. The sigh as the electricity cut, the shuffle of feet as someone reached for matches, the flicker of flame that held back the black. For outsiders, it would have seemed ordinary. But for those who lived there long enough, something different crept into those nights. The blackouts became whispered about not because of the storms, but because of what came with them. Old stories traveled from porch to porch in quiet tones, never spoken too loudly as though saying them aloud might draw attention. A woman told of hearing her deceased father's voice during one such outage, clear as if he stood at her shoulder, though he had been buried 2 decades earlier. A young man swore that while walking the main road in the dark, he heard footsteps following him, matching every pace. Yet when he turned, the road behind him was empty. Children, too innocent to be convincing liars, claimed they saw people standing in their rooms when the lights were gone, figures that dissolved when the matches struck. Each family had some piece of the puzzle, but no one wanted to assemble it. The darkness that swept over the town was not seen as an absence but as a presence, thick and waiting. The church bells rang less frequently as the years passed, but when they did, they carried warnings, not invitations. Once, when the blackout stretched into its second night, the bells rang without anyone pulling the rope. The sound was heavy, uneven, like a hand not used to its task. By morning, the tower stood empty, the rope swaying gently as if it had only just been released. Records from that night still exist, brittle and faded, written in the careful hand of a priest who confessed he no longer believed the darkness was natural. He wrote that the air felt as though it held breath, and the silence of the blackout was pierced not by the ringing but by whispers he could not trace. He left the town soon after, and his replacement never spoke of that night again. For the townspeople, life adjusted. They carried lanterns more often, built habits around anticipation, but habits did not erase dread. Generations passed down warnings in the form of advice. Never look directly into the corners of a dark room. Never answer if someone you know has been dead calls your name. Never leave mirrors uncovered during an outage, for the reflections sometimes moved too slowly to belong to you. Whether these were rituals born of superstition or survival, no one questioned them. They were rules, and rules carried the weight of truth when enough people obeyed. Yet even with their caution, the town carried scars. Children grew anxious when the skies darkened, clutching at their parents' hands. Families gathered in single rooms during storms, afraid to spread apart, afraid to be alone. And when the outages ended, when light returned and the hum of electricity crept back into the walls, no one spoke of what they thought they had heard or seen. Life resumed, but not cleanly. It resumed the way a wound closes over infection, hidden but festering, The unease became part of the air, as much a feature of the town as its cracked streets and leaning poles. In the wider region, outsiders dismissed the stories as fear mixed with poverty. Rural communities were always more superstitious, they claimed. Lack of resources fed paranoia. Darkness bred imagination. Those who spoke against it framed the town's fear as folklore, another ghost story to amuse children. But the consistency of the tales, the way they lined up without collusion, made the dismissals weak. A pattern emerged in every account. Silence too deep, air too heavy, the sense of not being alone. And though no one could prove it, the unease carried weight in the way people lived their lives. What remained most haunting was how the town never celebrated the return of light. In most places, relief is felt when lamps buzz again, when televisions resume their chatter, when order returns. Here, there was no cheering, no laughter, no communal sigh, only quiet relief, subdued, as though speaking too loudly might invite the dark back. No one trusted the light fully. No one believed it could hold forever. Every switch flipped on, every bulb that glowed, was treated as temporary. It was not the end of the darkness, but only a pause. And so the history of the town bent under the weight of its blackouts, its people reshaped by what they could not name but could not deny. Records of storms became records of disappearances, of accidents with no explanation, of people found wandering in shock with no memory of where they had been. Families who left the town spoke of relief, but even they carried habits forward. Nightlights, left on, candles never thrown away, unease in places without sound. The shadow of the town stretched with them, refusing to stay confined to its borders. This was the foundation on which everything else rested. The storms, the outages, the whispers, the warnings, all of it layered together until the town itself felt more like a waiting trap than a home. And for those who remained, those who lived through night after night of silence, a simple truth began to sink in. The darkness that arrived with the blackouts was not just a condition of weather or wires. It was something older, something patient, something that had always been there. And if that was true, then the question was no longer whether the lights would fail again. The question was who would be left when they did. It began on a night that looked no different from any other storm season evening. The air was thick with humidity, swollen clouds pressing low against the rooftops. The sun had set early, smothered by the storm's advancing shadow, leaving the streets already dim before true night had fallen. People hurried inside, closing their shutters and doors, bracing for rain and wind. They were used to it. The town had endured storms many times before. But on this night, there was something heavier in the air, something that clung to the skin like damp cloth. Those who remembered it later swore they could feel the night arrive, not in silence but in a soundless weight that pressed against every wall. The lights went out at 8:17 by the last working clock. There was no warning, no flicker, no surge, just a sudden collapse, as though the entire world had been swallowed at once. Houses went dark, the street lamps cut off. Even the distant glow from surrounding towns vanished. It was not a blackout that affected one neighborhood or one town, but an expanse of darkness that stretched further than anyone could see. The night became absolute. At first, people reached for candles, matches, lanterns, anything that could push the black away. But the light they summoned seemed weaker than usual, as if the shadows absorbed more than they should. The candles burned low, their flames trembling violently as though resisting some unseen breath. Matches extinguished themselves before reaching the wick. Lanterns sputtered with smoke. Some managed to keep their homes dimly lit, but most admitted later that the light barely reached beyond arm's length. The rooms around them seemed to retreat, swallowed by a silence that made every movement, every breath, sound too loud. On the main street, a shopkeeper opened her door to see if anyone else had lost power. She stepped into the darkness, holding a small candle cupped in her hand. She saw no one, but she swore she felt movement along the edge of the street, like figures shifting just out of sight. The candle's flame leaned sideways though there was no wind, and for a brief instant she saw what looked like a face at the far end of the road, tall, too pale, watching her without moving. When she blinked, it was gone. She retreated inside and barred her door, convinced she had imagined it, though her hand shook so violently she could not hold the lock steady. Across town, a family gathered in their living room, every candle they owned placed in a circle on the table. The father tried to reassure his children that it was only the storm, only the power lines again. But the children began crying, saying they could hear people whispering near the windows. The father walked to the window to prove them wrong, but as he leaned close, his breath fogged the glass and a second patch of fog appeared beside his, rising and fading in rhythm, as if another mouth exhaled just inches away on the other side. He ripped the curtain shut, but his children would not stop crying until morning. The blackout deepened. Hours passed without relief. The storm never broke into heavy rain as expected. There was thunder, distant but constant, but no downpour came. The air remained dry yet thick, making breathing laborious like inhaling smoke. People began reporting strange details, clocks that stopped ticking, radios that hissed static even without batteries, and pets that refused to move from corners, trembling and growling at nothing visible. Dogs barked at empty hallways, cats hissed into shadows. Even livestock in barns kicked at their stalls, restless, panicked. By midnight, the fear had spread. No one wanted to be alone. Neighbors called out to each other across the street, but their voices carried strangely, hollow and thin, as if swallowed before they reached the other side. Some said the echoes of their own words returned seconds later, distorted as though spoken by someone else. One man claimed he heard his name called from the dark, not in his wife's voice, not in his children's, but in something colder, something that stretched the syllables too long. He refused to answer. In one of the houses near the edge of town, a young girl disappeared. Her mother swore she had been asleep in bed, but when she went to check, the blankets were neatly folded back, the window still shut, the room cold. There was no sign of forced entry, no tracks, no sound, only silence. Neighbors searched the house by candlelight, their shadows bending on the walls, but they found nothing. Some whispered that the girl had been taken, not by a person, but by whatever moved through the blackout. Her name was not spoken again until daylight. Then there were the footsteps. Nearly every house claimed to hear them. Slow, deliberate, pacing in the hallways, across the roofs, on the porches. Sometimes they came alone. Sometimes they came in pairs, as if circling. No one dared open the doors to see. Those who pressed their ears against the wood said the steps stopped whenever they listened, resuming only after they pulled away. One woman said she felt the vibrations through the floorboards beneath her feet, as if someone walked directly under the house, though there was no space below. It was during these hours that people began to realize this blackout was not like the others. It was not only the absence of light, not only the silence. It was the presence of something else, something that waited patiently, revealing itself in fragments that never stayed long enough to prove. Fear settled into the town like fog, thick and suffocating. Every creak of wood, every flutter of curtains, every flicker of flame became unbearable. Families clung together, eyes wide, listening for the next sound, the next breath. The night dragged on with no sign of relief, no hum of power returning, no promise of morning. The storm outside did not pass. The thunder rolled endlessly, far but constant, as though circling the town without drawing closer. And beneath it, through the walls, through the silence, came the feeling that something moved with patience, not rushing, not hiding, but waiting. Waiting in the corners, waiting in the stairwells, waiting in the black that not even the bravest could pierce with their trembling flames. It was a night no one forgot, not because of what they saw, but because of what they could not. A night when the town began to understand that blackouts were not accidents, not natural failures of a system too old to hold. They were invitations, and something always answered. When the sun finally rose, the town looked unchanged on the surface. Houses still stood, streets still cut the same weary paths through cracked pavement. But for those who had endured the hours of silence, the morning did not bring comfort. It brought questions, and the answers, when gathered together, did not fit into a shape that could be explained. What remained after the blackout was not relief, but fragments of evidence that made little sense when pieced together. The girl who vanished from her bed was the first subject of search. Neighbors and family combed through the house, the yard, and the narrow woods beyond the edge of town. Nothing appeared disturbed. The ground was not muddy, yet there were no footprints. The windows were locked from the inside. The door remained bolted. She had simply ceased to be present. Her mother could not stop repeating that the bed looked too neat, as if the blankets had been lifted with deliberate care, not tossed aside in the way a child might leave them. The sheets were cold. No one could explain where she had gone. Other families reported smaller details, but when placed together, they painted something far stranger. One man showed neighbors his clock, which had stopped precisely at 8:17 the moment the blackout struck. He wound it again, but the hands would not move. Another family claimed every mirror in their home had cracked during the night. Not shattered, not broken, but split down the center with thin black lines that seemed to spread from the corners outward. They swore the cracks had not been there before, and yet the glass showed no signs of impact. A woman held up a candle stub that had melted into a shape she insisted no natural flame could create, twisted into something sharp and jagged as if sculpted by a hand rather than melted by heat. Then there were the sounds. Almost every household described footsteps, though none agreed where they came from. Some said the steps were on the roof, heavy and dragging. Others insisted they circled outside the walls. A few whispered that the steps had been inside, pacing between rooms though no door had opened. When pressed, some admitted that the footsteps stopped whenever they tried to follow, resuming only when they sat in silence, too frightened to move. Children described voices that called from the corners, too faint to understand, though one boy said he heard his own name spoken 3 times before his father struck a match and the sound ceased. The animals provided their own testimony. Dogs hid beneath furniture and refused to emerge until daylight. Horses kicked and screamed in their stalls, eyes rolling, foam streaking their jaws. Chickens were found dead in their coops without wounds, their bodies rigid, their eyes wide. One farmer described it as if something had passed through the barn during the night, leaving behind only fear and silence. He swore the air inside still smelled wrong, metallic and sharp, hours after morning had come. Conflicting details made the accounts difficult to reconcile. Some insisted they saw shapes move in the dark, faces at windows, shadows crossing rooms. Others swore there was nothing visible at all, only the sense of being watched. Some heard whispers while others heard breathing. But what tied every account together was the certainty that the night had not been empty. Whether they described sounds, sights, or silence, every voice returned to the same refrain. Something was present. Something that should not have been there. When a local official attempted to gather formal testimony, he found the community reluctant. People shook their heads, shrugged, dismissed their own words as exhaustion or imagination. Yet their hands trembled, their eyes wandered to corners as they spoke. It was not disbelief that silenced them. It was fear of naming what they had felt. Still, enough fragments were recorded to raise questions. Doors had been found unlocked, though no one remembered unbolting them. Drawers were pulled open. Chairs shifted a few inches out of place. None of it could be proven as malicious intrusion, yet none could be explained. A teacher who lived alone in a small apartment above the abandoned school offered the most unsettling account. She claimed she had lit 3 candles in her kitchen and watched their flames bend in unison, leaning toward the hallway as though pulled by an unseen current. She sat frozen, certain something stood there in the dark. Hours later, she found faint scratches along the hallway wall, long and parallel, etched into plaster that had been smoothed the day before. She refused to remain in the apartment another night and moved in with relatives. When asked later what she believed caused it, she whispered that she thought something had been testing the walls, as if searching for a way inside. Confusion deepened when reports were compared. Some said the night lasted longer than it should have, that dawn seemed delayed. Others swore the blackout ended sooner for them, though their clocks showed no difference. A few claimed to have dreamed vividly during the night, though they had been awake. Dreams of endless hallways, of doors that opened onto nothing, of voices urging them to step forward. These dreams blurred with memory until even they could not separate what had happened in the dark from what had occurred in their minds. What made the investigation futile was not only the contradictions but the lack of evidence that could satisfy explanation. No intruder footprints, no forced entry, no mechanical fault beyond the collapsed grid. The power company eventually reported that a main line had failed several miles away, though no storm damage was found at the site. To them it was an accident, nothing more. To the town it was another silence written over with words that did not fit. The only undeniable evidence remained in the people themselves. They carried the night in their eyes, in the hesitation of their movements, in the quiet way they spoke afterward. Some refused to sleep in the dark again, keeping candles lit even after electricity returned. Others refused to remain in their homes, moving in with family or leaving the town altogether. And though no body was found, no crime traced, everyone felt the absence of the girl whose bed was left empty. Her name lingered in silence, a reminder that the blackout had taken something real, something that could not be dismissed as imagination. The town's archives recorded it as a power failure, followed by a search effort. But the people who lived through it never accepted that explanation. They knew what silence had pressed against them, what presence had lingered in the dark. The evidence may have been incomplete, fractured, impossible to reconcile, but together it revealed something more disturbing than clarity. It revealed intention. The footsteps, the whispers, the missing girl, the marks on the walls, all of it suggested something that did not simply arrive with the blackout, but used it. Something that moved when light collapsed and waited until the silence was deep enough to hold it. And though morning came, no one felt that the night had truly ended. It lingered, like a shadow still standing just behind the glow of daylight, unseen but waiting for the next moment the power failed. The human body can forget the sharp edge of pain, but it never forgets fear. Long after the blackout ended, the town carried it like an illness passed from one person to another, invisible yet contagious. The silence of that night did not fade with the sunrise. It stayed lodged beneath the skin, heavy in the chest, waiting in the corners of every house. Days passed, but people moved differently now. They closed doors with more care. They locked windows more often. They left lamps burning through the night, unwilling to let any corner fall completely into shadow. For many, sleep became shallow, restless, filled with dreams that felt too much like memory. Children were the most fragile witnesses. They whispered about what they had seen. Not in grand stories, but in fragments too simple to ignore. A girl said she saw someone standing in the hallway during the blackout. Someone taller than her father, though no one had been there when light returned. A boy drew faces that did not belong to anyone in town. Pale, eyeless, half-formed sketches he refused to explain. Teachers noticed that children stared at windows during lessons, their attention breaking at small noises. Some of them refused to sleep in their own beds, crawling into their parents' rooms, claiming the dark was not safe anymore. For adults, the fear was quieter, but more corrosive. Conversations about the night always began with rational words, power lines, storms, imagination, but always ended in silence, unfinished sentences, eyes turned downward. Men who once laughed at superstition now carried candles in their pockets. Women who once stood on their porches at dusk now shut themselves inside before the sun dipped below the hills. A heaviness grew in the town, not only from what had happened but from the realization that no one could explain it. Explanations provide distance, silence does not, and so silence wrapped around every household, a veil no one dared pull away. The family of the missing girl carried the deepest wound. They left her bedroom untouched, the bed neatly folded, the curtains still drawn. Some nights her mother swore she heard footsteps upstairs, soft and deliberate, pacing the room where her daughter had once slept. Her father began drinking heavily, avoiding the house whenever night approached, lingering instead at the edge of town until daylight came. The absence of their child was not only grief but proof, living proof, that the blackout had taken more than comfort. It had taken something alive, and nothing would ever convince them otherwise. The strain spread into the smallest aspects of daily life. People grew suspicious of one another, wondering if some had seen more than they admitted, wondering if others carried secrets about what had moved in the dark. Trust fractured. One neighbor accused another of lying about hearing whispers, certain that too many voices matched across the town to be coincidence. Another family claimed the disappearance of the girl was not supernatural, but the act of someone within the community, though they could name no culprit. These accusations did not heal fear. They sharpened it, turning it inward. The town became a place of watchful eyes and closed mouths, where everyone waited for another night to come and prove them right or wrong. The psychological toll deepened in ways no one could predict. Some refused to sleep at all, drinking coffee through the night, staring at their windows as if daring the darkness to move. Others covered every reflective surface in their homes, claiming mirrors felt unsafe, that reflections might shift again as they had during the blackout. A few moved away entirely, abandoning homes that had been in their families for generations. They left without explanation, without farewell, unable to live in a place where night had betrayed them. Those who remained began to shape their lives around fear, though they would never admit it. Candles became more common than clocks. Radios were kept close even when silent. Families gathered in single rooms when storms rolled in, not because they expected power loss, but because they could not stand the thought of being apart if it happened again. The sound of thunder became unbearable, not because of rain, but because it reminded them of the endless rolling that had circled the town during the blackout. Thunder without storm, sound without source. It is difficult to measure the true cost of fear, but in this town it was visible in every gesture. The way hands lingered on doorknobs before opening them, the way people glanced over their shoulders on the street after dusk. The way laughter came less often, sharp and brief, quickly fading as though joy itself felt dangerous. Fear had moved beyond an event. It had become an atmosphere, thick as smoke, saturating every life that remained. Experts who later studied the accounts offered their own theories. They called it collective trauma, mass suggestion, the brain's desperate attempt to fill voids of sensory deprivation with images and sounds. They spoke of stress-induced hallucinations, of paranoia fed by isolation. But their words never reached the people who had lived through it. They did not need theories. They had memory, and memory carried weight heavier than explanation. The most haunting truth was how easily the mind adjusted to fear when it had no alternative. After months passed, no one truly expected safety anymore. They learned to live with unease, to breathe with it, to sleep beside it. But deep down, every person carried the same knowledge. The blackout had not been random. It had not been a simple failure of wires. It had been something else. And if it came once, it could come again. The waiting became its own form of torment. Every flicker of a light bulb, every brief stutter of electricity sent waves of panic through the town. People froze, listening for silence, waiting to feel that heavy pressure again. Even when the lights held, even when nothing happened, the fear lingered longer than the moment. In truth, the blackout had never ended. It remained alive in their minds, spreading through their days and nights. And fear of the next silence became worse than silence itself. Because they all knew the truth, though none spoke it. The dark had not passed them by. It had only paused. When fear becomes too heavy, people search for explanations the way drowning hands search for air. The blackout became the subject of countless conversations, hushed arguments, and even official inquiries, each struggling to contain something that resisted being named. Investigators came with clipboards and questions, their language precise, their expressions calm. They collected statements from those who agreed to speak, measured damage to lines and transformers, and traced the supposed cause to a failed section of grid outside the town. Their report was clean, tidy, sterile. A mechanical fault, nothing more. Wires old, poles weakened, weather too strong, a natural collapse inevitable, ordinary. The words sounded reasonable. They were designed to sound reasonable, but they carried no weight against the memories of those who had endured the silence. The townspeople knew that explanation was a mask. The storm had not struck hard enough to break lines. There had been no wind strong enough, no rain heavy enough. And if wires had failed, why had the night stretched on without a single sign of crews working to repair it? Why had power returned without the sound of engines or the sight of repairmen in the streets? The official story had no room for the footsteps, no place for the missing girl, no line in its pages for voices that spoke in the dark. It left the most crucial evidence untouched, dismissed as hallucination, stress, or folklore. But folklore was not so easy to dismiss. As the weeks passed, people unearthed older stories buried in the town's history. A newspaper clipping from decades earlier described another blackout, shorter but just as silent, during which a man vanished from his front porch without sound or trace. His wife had spoken of figures in the road, but her testimony was never recorded in official archives. Another report from even earlier mentioned a schoolteacher who had walked home in the dark and never arrived. Her lantern discovered extinguished in the middle of the road. These accounts had been forgotten, left to rot in drawers and boxes until the recent blackout forced them to the surface again. Suddenly a pattern took shape, not of weather or wires, but of absence. Absence of light, absence of safety, absence of people. Psychologists who reviewed the case later called it a communal reaction to stress. In their view, the blackout had triggered a mass psychological event, a blending of fear, memory, and suggestion. They argued that once a few people claimed to hear footsteps or whispers, others had unconsciously followed, shaping their own fear into the same pattern. They called it contagion of the mind, a spread of belief as potent as any disease. The missing girl, they argued, was unrelated. Perhaps she had wandered outside. Perhaps she had fallen into the nearby woods. Perhaps her disappearance was tragic coincidence. To them, the event was explainable, if not entirely comforting. But their theories, clinical and detached, satisfied no one who had lived through the night. The darker theories came not from experts, but from the people who had listened too closely to the silence. Some whispered of cults, claiming the blackout had been a ritual, a deliberate cutting of light to invite something old into the town. They pointed to the strange scratches on walls, to the cracked mirrors, to the sound of bells ringing without hands. They insisted these were signs of invocation, echoes of practices long buried in the soil. No cult was ever discovered, no evidence of ritual ever found, yet the idea clung to conversations like rot, spreading unease into even the most rational minds. Others rejected the idea of human involvement entirely. They spoke of something older than belief, something that thrived in darkness itself. They described it not as a creature but as a presence, vast and formless, moving wherever light collapsed. The blackout, they said, was not caused by storms or wires but by that presence itself, pulling light from the air, silencing sound to feed on fear. The missing girl, in their eyes, had been taken not by chance but by design. Not stolen, not killed, but absorbed into the silence, consumed by it the way a candle flame is consumed by a breath. The most unsettling theory of all came from those who claimed the blackout was not an intrusion, but a glimpse. That what the town had experienced was not something entering their world, but the world itself revealed without light. They suggested that darkness is not emptiness but the natural state of things, and what humans call light is nothing more than a fragile layer stretched thin over reality. When the blackout stripped it away, they argued the town saw what was always there, waiting beyond sight. The watchers, the footsteps, the whispers. The blackout had not brought them. It had only exposed them. No investigation could disprove these whispers. No theory could erase the testimony of children who woke screaming, of families who heard breathing at their windows, of animals that refused to eat for days. The officials closed their reports and filed them away, but the town remained open, raw, wounded by questions left unanswered. Fear needs little proof to survive, and what the people had endured was more than enough. Even those who tried to dismiss it found themselves faltering. A man who once laughed at superstition admitted to his neighbor that he kept a lantern by his bed now. A woman who insisted it was all imagination confessed that she had moved her children into a single room for sleep, unable to leave them scattered through the house. Actions betrayed words. Theories collapsed beneath memory. The blackout became more than an event. It became a division. Before, there had been ordinary fear of storms, of wires failing, of accidents. After, there was only one fear, larger and heavier than all the rest, that the silence would come again. And so the investigations ended, not with clarity but with fracture. Official explanations held their shape on paper, clean and precise. Local theories crawled through whispers and memories, jagged and unfinished. The truth hung somewhere between unreachable, or perhaps it was spread across both, refusing to be contained by reason alone. What lingered was not closure but tension, stretched thin across the town, humming faintly like a wire before it snaps. The blackout had not been solved. It had only been recorded, and what had been recorded was enough to remind everyone that silence is never as empty as it seems. Time moved forward, but the night of the blackout did not fade into the past. It lingered, not as memory alone but as a weight in the air, woven into every creak of the houses, every flicker of light, every silence that stretched too long. People in the town tried to tell themselves it had ended, that the power failure was behind them, that life could be restored to something like before. Yet each evening, when the sun slipped lower and shadows climbed the walls, they felt the same chill, the same quiet dread. Fear does not vanish. It only settles deeper, waiting to surface. In years that followed, whenever the lights flickered or dimmed, panic spread instantly. Mothers pulled children close. Men froze where they stood. Everyone listened, holding breath, waiting to feel if the silence would return. Even when the lights steadied again, even when nothing else happened, the damage remained. The town no longer trusted electricity. They no longer trusted the fragile hum in the wires. They no longer trusted the thin shield of light against the black. What they had learned in that long night could not be unlearned. The dark was not absence. It was presence. Some left, abandoning their homes, their family graves, their histories. They claimed new lives elsewhere, but whispers followed them. Their habits betrayed them. Curtains drawn too tightly, lamps burning all night, mirrors covered during storms. Others stayed, bound to the soil of their ancestors, too rooted to leave even as fear hollowed their days. They carried on, planting gardens, working small jobs, sending children to school. Yet behind every routine was the quiet knowledge that the blackout was not over. It had only paused. And always there was the missing girl. Her absence became more than grief. It became proof. Her name was never spoken in town gatherings, never carved into stone, never placed in prayer. To speak it aloud was to acknowledge that she had not been lost but taken. That silence itself had claimed her. Some said her laughter could still be heard faintly at night, drifting from the woods. Others swore they saw her in their dreams, standing at the edge of a room, watching without speaking, her eyes empty. Her parents grew gray before their time, hollow-eyed and quiet, as if part of them remained trapped in that night, unable to escape even with daylight. Theories continued to circle, but explanations no longer mattered. What mattered was survival, and survival meant silence. The town stopped asking questions, stopped comparing stories, stopped searching for answers. They chose not to dig deeper, as if the act of seeking might invite it back. Fear became their form of worship. They gave the dark no names, offered no challenge, left no invitation. They simply endured, waiting, dreading, listening. But silence does not forget. Blackouts continued in other places, distant towns and cities far away, each with their own small tragedies. Accidents, disappearances, moments no one could explain. The reports were scattered, disconnected, yet they echoed the same rhythm. Lights failed without warning. Clocks stopped. Animals panicked. People spoke of shadows, of footsteps, of whispers. Some dismissed them as rumor, coincidence, hysteria. But to those who had lived through the long night in the forgotten town, it was confirmation. Whatever had moved in their silence was not confined. It traveled. It searched. It waited wherever light grew thin. This knowledge became unbearable to consider. If the blackout had not been unique, then no place was safe. Cities with glowing skylines, neighborhoods with backup generators, remote villages with lanterns, it made no difference. Every defense failed eventually. Every shield weakened, and when it did, silence would fill the space, heavy and complete, carrying with it the same unseen presence. Perhaps it had always been this way. Perhaps every blackout since the invention of light had carried its mark. Only some deep enough to leave scars, and yet, perhaps the most disturbing truth is not that the dark arrives from outside, but that it lives inside the human mind. That what people feel during the silence is not intrusion but recognition, a memory of what it means to be prey. A reminder that safety was always an illusion built on fragile wires and trembling flames. That what moved in the blackout was not new but ancient, waiting longer than anyone has been alive, waiting for lights to fail, waiting for voices to still, waiting to step forward into the silence and remain unseen. It leaves a question hanging, a question too heavy to answer but impossible to ignore. What if blackouts are not accidents of infrastructure, not storms, not failures of machines, but opportunities? What if every silence hides not absence but presence, pressing against the walls close enough to touch, patient enough to wait? And when the lights return, when relief floods through the body, what if that relief is false? Because something has already stepped closer, already chosen, already marked who will not wake the next time the power fails? The town remains. Its people breathe, work, sleep, but never without fear. Each night they glance at the lamps, at the wires, at the bulbs glowing weakly against the dark. Each night they wonder if the hum will hold. They wonder when silence will press again against their walls. And when it does, they know it will not be empty. So ask yourself this: When the lights in your own home flicker, when the screen before you dims, when the hum of the refrigerator cuts for a breath too long, what exactly do you think is standing with you in the dark?